For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Today on The Gist, we're going live to Sao Paulo to check on the Brazilian presidential elections, what it means domestically and for the country's foreign policy. Let me welcome all our guests who are joining this live stream and all of those of you who will pick up this stream later on our YouTube channel. Like I said, we're going live to Sao Paulo in Brazil, and we are joined for the first time on our platform by Professor Guilherme Casarões. He's a political scientist, a professor at the very prestigious FGV EAESP. He's also a foreign policy analyst and far-right movement analyst. He's the coordinator with the Extreme Right Observatory in Brazil. Professor, thank you so much for giving us time. We do know that you're much sought after by international and domestic news agencies. Welcome to StratNews Global.
Amitabh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours, Professor. A quick comment from you on this remarkable comeback from corruption charges, prison for two-time President Lula, but a narrow win, which just shows how polarized Brazil is. When he left in 2010 after two terms, I think he had a 80+% approval rating. Now, with all that has gone on in the last 12 years, is this an attempt to rebuild his legacy?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it was a massive win for Lula, to be honest, because Lula was facing the incumbent president with a lot of political and economic resources at hand to push for his own victory. It's very hard to fight against the incumbent president. It's the first time, by the way, that in the Brazilian election, an incumbent president loses a re-election attempt. So as a first, I think we have to think about the whole circumstances that led to Lula's win and Bolsonaro loss. I think that Lula is one of the most important, if not the most important political figure in 21st century Brazil's political history. Lula has been a very popular president, as you've mentioned before. He stepped out of office with more than 83% of popular approval rating. So that was really massive at the time. I mean, he left office as the most popular president in the history of Western democracies or something along the same lines. And he did indeed run a very successful administration for 8 years back in the early 2000s. Of course, the conditions were very different. Brazil was going through a commodity boom. Politics was stable. There were corruption scandals back in the day, but none of them really tainted Lula's image. But then things started to change, right? It took a turn for the worse after President Rousseff, who was Lula's natural successor, took office. Brazil entered the long recession period. Politics was no longer stable. And Lula was finally put in jail thanks to the car wash corruption investigations that started in 2014. Lula was arrested in 2018. So if you look at his personal trajectory, he was indeed, he has made indeed quite a comeback. But Lula has remained very popular along the way. Even when he went to jail, half the country was still very much supportive of Lula, especially because they saw Lula as being persecuted, as being politically persecuted. And indeed, if you look at the trials and the proceedings of the car wash investigation operations, it seems to have been very much biased against Lula and the Workers' Party. So this is one thing that really has really contributed to further polarization around Lula's image. But then we have another thing, which is Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's role in modern day Brazil, so to speak. Brazil has taken a far right turn in 2018. Bolsonaro was seen not only as an anti-Lula and anti-Workers' Party candidate, but also as an anti-establishment candidate. And it was a time back in 2018 when people were just fed up with politics, with parties. The car wash investigations had found out that every single big political party in Brazil was involved in corruption scandals. So basically, Bolsonaro could capture people's anti-establishment and anti-Workers' Party sentiments and transform it into a successful presidential campaign. So when he won in 2018, he won as an outsider. The thing is that in 2022, Bolsonaro, after 4 years in office, is no longer an outsider. So he's got the whole public structures in his hands. He has used many different tools, including a secret budget, which is possibly the most scandalous corruption scheme that we had, that we've ever had in the country, even though it's kind of legal. So that's where the problems are right now. But anyways, I think that the final result reflects, on the one hand, a very powerful president using every resource that he had within his reach to win the election, a very ideological base supporting Bolsonaro. We also have to consider that in the last 4 years, many people started to buy conspiracy theories of all kinds, and people were just being bombarded with fake news coming from all over, and that has certainly helped Bolsonaro's not only campaign, but also his way of governing the country. And at the same time, we have a very divisive yet very popular president. So that's the situation we are right now.
Sure, you mentioned Bolsonaro and the various tools, social media being one of them. He's very vocal, but we saw silence for 2 days, and then he spoke for what, 2 minutes yesterday?
2 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, many would say he didn't really concede. He hasn't congratulated Lula. Of course, he has instructed his chief of staff to start the process of transition. But if you go back a little bit to the 30th or to Sunday, I think on his social media Twitter handle, he posted a video endorsement from former President Trump, describing him as one of the greatest politicians in the world, urging the Brazilian people not to lose him. Explain Bolsonaro's extreme right-wing politics and the resonance, a huge resonance, because in the end, Lula has just pipped him.
Yeah, when Bolsonaro ran for the first time in 2018, he presented himself as a Bolso Trump, right? He really wanted to associate his image to the one of Donald Trump, who at the time, 2018, was still in the presidency of the United States. So he was maybe the most important source of legitimization of Bolsonaro's candidacy. And I do believe, as a political analyst, that Bolsonaro would not have won the 2018 race if Trump hadn't won the 2016 race in the United States, because it's all part of a wave, a part of a far-right, conservative, populist, authoritarian wave that we are witnessing in many parts of the world. And Bolsonaro really mimics, he follows Trump's playbook almost literally sometimes. During the pandemic, for example, with the hydroxychloroquine discussions in early March, all the way through 2020, Bolsonaro has pretty much done every single thing that Trump was doing back in the United States. And this is probably so because the far right in the world, but especially the far right across the Americas, is very transnational, right? It starts with Trump, but then you have Steve Bannon coming around to Brazil to help Bolsonaro's campaign. So this transnational characteristic of the far right in the Americas somehow empowers Bolsonaro to do a lot of things that Trump has already done in the United States, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And what Bolsonaro did in the last couple of weeks was nothing but the Brazilian version of the American big lie, right? You remember the big lie: stop the count, elections are fraudulent, and so on and so forth. So he tried to do the same thing here. Now, I think that there is a fundamental difference between Trump and Bolsonaro, which is Trump was able to capture, two differences, if I can put it this way. First thing is, Trump was able to capture quite successfully the Republican Party, and the Republican Party structures. So Trump is poised to come back in 2024 as the Republican candidate. Trump holds a very strong majority within the Republican Party as of today. And we in Brazil, we have a multi-party system, just like India, but way more fragmented. Because you see, Bolsonaro has got the biggest number of seats in the House of Representatives. Out of 513 seats, Bolsonaro's got 99, but it's far from the majority. So any president has to form this overarching coalition to govern. And because of that, I think that Bolsonaro has a greater difficulty, because even though he's got like 99 Congress people in maybe 20-something senators out of 81, so he's got a good number of politicians supporting him, it's not enough to form a majority that blocks any attempts of Lula at pushing for legislation and everything. So I think this is one thing. Trump's got a more comfortable position, because you see, if the Republicans win the midterm elections in the United States right now, Trump will have the upper hand to come back in 2024. But at the same time, there's another difference, which is Trump doesn't have the backing of the military. Bolsonaro does, or at least partially. What we saw in the period of his long 2-day silence, many truck drivers and protesters blocked roads all across the country. Brazil's a huge country. More than 11 states out of 27 had roads, federal roads, blocked by truck drivers who didn't want to accept the elections results, or by protesters who didn't want to accept the elections results. So that was the kind of reaction that Bolsonaro was probably expecting. And his silence somehow authorized these protesters to keep on going with the roadblocks, no matter how much damage, economic and human damage, it might have caused. We hear reports from people who needed to go to the hospital, cancer treatment patients who couldn't get to the hospital, or people who are not willing, who are not able to get their medicines because our logistics depend so much on roads. So whenever there's a roadblock, it's chaos in the entire country. Many flights coming from the United States and Europe had to be canceled, had to turn back, because the main airport, the main international airport of Brazil in São Paulo, was blocked by protesters. So that's the situation we had for the 48 hours that succeeded Lula's victory in the ballots. And Bolsonaro, by not saying anything, he kept authorizing people to keep doing it. I read a journalist who wrote yesterday, I guess, Bolsonaro's silence is not really silence, but the continuation of Bolsonaro's conspiracy theories against the elections that he has been playing around for many, many years now. So his silence was basically, I'm not willing to accept the results. I'm not okay with all that. So protesters, please act on my behalf. I'm not going to tell you to do anything. We call it dog whistle. So I'm not saying anything. I'm not going to be open about it, but you can do whatever you want to do, because I'm authorizing you by not saying anything. And in his concession speech, which was a 2-minute long concession speech, rather bizarre really, because he didn't say anything. He didn't say Lula, the name. He didn't mention the name. He didn't say anything about the elections. He basically said, people who are protesting in the streets, they do so because they are unhappy about the way elections have been conducted. I mean, what exactly does he mean by this? From a legal point of view, he has not accepted Lula's win, because he didn't say anything. I mean, we want to interpret what Bolsonaro said in the best light possible. But as a far-right researcher, I know that we cannot interpret what people say, what politicians say, in the best light. We have to read between the lines and try to understand how it's going to sound to protesters. And I feel that even though Bolsonaro was there and he made a formal session to announce whatever he wanted to announce on that day, I think that protesters still think that Bolsonaro keeps authorizing him to do whatever they want. Today's national holiday in Brazil. It's the Day of the Dead, the souls. And because of that, it's a national holiday. So nothing's working today. Everything's closed. And there are people calling on protests in front of military headquarters, of our army and Navy headquarters all across the country. And I think that Bolsonaro's further positions will depend on how it goes today. Because if it flops, Bolsonaro is going to feel, well, I don't have as much support, as much popular support in the streets as I thought of, so I'm going to step back. But if it doesn't flop, if many people take the streets today, calling upon a military intervention or something along these lines, Bolsonaro might try to change his rhetoric, and he might even not accept the results. I mean, officially not accept the results. So that's the kind of situation we're at right now. And it's really distressing for all of us, because it's a psychological game at the end of the day. We cannot get to sleep at night without thinking, what is Bolsonaro going to say tomorrow? It's not a normal situation of democracy, right?
So over the next few days and over the next 2 months, the transition itself, even if the process starts, that could be sabotaged. So Lula has a lot to do domestically over the next few days, weeks, months, and 4 years. But I want your thoughts, Professor, on his possible potential foreign policy. I know in one of your interviews, you mentioned how he had been abroad for over 400 days, I think, in his 8-year, 2 terms. That's probably not going to happen considering his age. But how do you see his foreign policy developing, considering so much has changed since 2010, whether it's Russia's war in Ukraine or the China-US confrontation? And before you do that, I just want to take a couple of questions and observations that our viewers are putting out there. Matara says, is there going to be any change in Brazil's position vis-a-vis Russia and the Ukraine war and China now that Lula has won? And Dinesh Kumar adds, Lula recently had a statement where he held Zelensky accountable for this war. According to Dinesh's knowledge, Lula can't outright support Russia now, but he can't be critical either.
Okay, foreign policy is the apple of Lula's eyes. I mean, ever since he took office in 2003, he has placed a lot of energy and a lot of interest in foreign policy making. He really wanted to take Brazil to the position of an emerging power. And you probably remember that, Amitabh. I mean, that was India and Brazil coming together, IPSA and the BRICS. So everyone was so excited back then. I'm happy for India, really, because now India is poised to be the world's 3rd largest economy. Brazil's lagging behind, unfortunately. So the conditions have indeed changed for our country. But I'd say that Lula has a good advantage at this point, because foreign policy is one of the few things that the executive branch can do irrespective of Congress. Of course, treaties have to be undersigned and ratified by Congress too, but the executive branch has the upper hand in foreign policy making. So Lula is going to explore this, of course, to his best benefit. I don't see, and I agree with you, I don't see a place for an emerging Brazil as we had in 2003. The conditions are different. Now we have like a Cold War-like situation between China and the United States. We have a war at the heart of Europe between Russia and Ukraine. So the global conditions are not really friendly for an emerging Brazil. So I think that Lula realizes that, and Lula understands that if he's going to leave a legacy, he's probably not going to run for re-election. But if he's going to leave a legacy for the next 4 years, it's going to be more of a regional legacy than a global one, right? I remember that back in 2010, Lula signed a deal with Iran and Turkey. I mean, a nuclear deal with Iran prior to the JCPOA negotiations. So Lula really wanted to leave back then a global legacy. Nowadays, I don't think Brazil has as much clout as he used to have. So regionally, I think that there are 2 things that Lula might be willing to do. Things that would make me very, very happy, really. The first one is return to regional integration mechanisms. They have been abandoned over the last 5 or 6 years. That even came before Bolsonaro took office. Bolsonaro basically turned his back to Mercosur and UNISOR, the regional integration mechanisms that we used to have. And the second thing is, and it kind of relates to the first, Lula is probably going to deal with the Venezuelan situation. Venezuela is an authoritarian regime. Maduro runs an authoritarian regime. It's a left-wing authoritarian populist regime. So I think that Lula has to, the South American left has been given a bad name thanks to Maduro. And I think that Lula has to address this by somehow helping pacify Venezuela. This is hard. No president has been able to do it over the last 5 years. But I think that Lula has the charisma, has the engagement, and has enough proximity with Maduro to talk him out of office, or at least to try to bring the country together. That's going to be Lula's main diplomatic legacy. But of course, Lula has a long story with foreign policy. So that's the reason why he's probably going to turn his eyes towards Africa. Africa is one of the most dynamic regions of the world. Brazil has also abandoned African initiatives for the last 10 years or so. And I think that Lula will somehow restore Brazil's African policies. I've been speaking with people from his campaign and especially the foreign policy team of his campaign is very much interested and engaged in African initiatives that will help even the Brazilian economy to re-energize by exporting to Africa, especially manufactured goods. And of course, the BRICS and Asia will also have a very special place in Lula's foreign policy. And when it comes to that, and trying to answer some of the questions that came from the audience, I think that Lula will have to be very pragmatic when it comes to foreign policy towards Asia, for example. So I don't think that Lula will have any ideological connections with China. Lula will try to do some even-handed approach between India and China in the context of the BRICS. Lula will also have a very strong relationship with President Biden of the United States. He has done so before. I mean, he was friends with George W. Bush. He was friends with Obama. He had good relations with both of them. So I think that Lula is also poised to build a very prosperous relationship with the American administration, especially around two very important issues. The first one, democracy, liberal democracy, and that's something that Biden has been talking about very frequently, and also climate change. So this is something that I really envision for Lula's foreign policy. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, Lula has indeed been very critical of Volodymyr Zelensky's role in the war, in NATO. But I think that Lula, as a 20th century man, he still sees the war in Ukraine in a very dichotomous way. He sees it as NATO versus Russia, and Russia as some sort of anti-imperialist force. Lula's got to update some of his views on foreign policy, and that's natural. This passage of Lula criticizing Zelensky was part of an interview to, I think, The Economist or something. But it was not really the centerpiece of his interview. I don't think he has reflected a lot on the Russian-Ukraine war. And both, by the way, both presidents, Zelensky and Putin, have congratulated Lula in a distance of a few minutes between them. So I think that Lula will also have a very pragmatic stance when it comes to the Russian-Ukraine war. He's not going to take sides with Russia against Ukraine and against the United States as a consequence, but he's not going to take sides with Ukraine either. So pragmatism and a sort of diplomatic positionings are part of Lula's foreign policy background. So I think he's going to use it to Brazil's best benefit right now.
Sure. Lula, as you pointed out, had close relations with India in his 2 terms. He was even awarded the Indira Gandhi Peace Prize 2 years after his second term ended. But how do you see specifically that developing? You mentioned BRICS, IBSA, that had a meeting. They had the foreign ministers had a meeting in New York City after a long time, just a few months back. India, of course, is also looking at crude imports because of the situation vis-a-vis energy, and there's been some investment, or at least beginning of some investment in the energy sector in Brazil, right? Apart from a little bit of military engagement, India, of course, this year also launched a satellite for you.
Yeah, so I basically see 4 areas of potential engagement between Brazil and India. The first one is, as you said, investments in the energy sector, and especially in the high-tech energy sector, maybe clean energy. It's not just about oil, of course. We have wind power, we have solar power, and these are technologies that Lula, as I see it, is probably going to try and invest a lot in. Lula loves oil. I mean, he's got this love story with Petrobras, but I think that at the same time, he also sees as a president that has to become more modern and to embrace a more modern economic agenda. He knows that energy, green energy, is trending in the world right now, and Brazil has a lot of potential. The second area of cooperation is food security. India and Brazil are both large agriculture producers, but they also suffer from inequality and poverty. So there's this very delicate balance between being food security providers to the world and food security suppliers to their own society. So I think that there is room for cooperation, especially in the World Trade Organization negotiations on agriculture. A third aspect of cooperation that I really see as very prosperous is climate change. Both countries, they have invested a lot in the environmental discussions. Bolsonaro has abandoned some of the protagonism that Brazil used to have, and some of these initiatives have been just left behind. And I think that Lula has a very strong commitment to climate change, and that's going to bring many countries together. And Brazil is one of these countries who he's probably very committed to advancing the Paris Agreement agenda and the 2030 agenda, and so on and so forth. And finally, there's a fourth one, which is providing global public goods, especially when it comes to health. India and Brazil were two of the greatest healthcare providers for the world in terms of drugs, medicines, technology, pharma. The pharma industry of both countries is very, very significant to the rest of the world. And I think that Brazil and India might well re-energize the IBSA group to keep providing technical cooperation for countries in need of vaccines, in need of drugs for COVID and for any other pandemic that might just come around. So I think that there's a lot of potential between both countries, not only because of their similar worldviews, but also because of their similar position in world affairs right now.
Sure. We're seeing the launch of the Amazonia 1 mission, which I think is supposed to give high resolution pictures or data of the Amazon deforestation, which Bolsonaro was responsible a lot for. But in geopolitics, the Modi government in India has made it clear that national interests are the most important. And that's exemplified by, say, India's position. You're saying that Lula would probably also do the same thing in the Russian war and relations with Russia. The G20, now India will head it next year, then it's Brazil, and in 2026, it's South Africa. So those three countries in BRICS, without the Russia and China, can they work together over the next few years on several different dimensions?
I think so. And I think that there are a few things connecting the three countries. It's not just about their position as regional powers. It's not just about their position as developing and in emerging economies, but also their position as democracies. I think that's the most important thing connecting the three countries. The BRICS is a very important grouping, and I recognize the role of the BRICS in several different initiatives that we've seen over the last couple of years. But the BRICS is a very asymmetrical grouping, right, in terms of power and in terms of political views, right, to the inside and to the outside. So I think that what really connects India, Brazil, and South Africa is their commitment to democracy, besides everything else. So I think that this commitment to democracy, which is part of India's identity as the oldest democracy in the post-colonial world, and of Brazil and South Africa, I think that their commitment is one of the main platforms for greater cooperation between the countries and for greater cooperation even with the United States in some respects, because that's one major point of concern among Western democracies. I mean, democracies are being assaulted, democracies are being undermined from the inside. So I think that big democracies like ours have a very special role in safeguarding democracy in the long run, safeguarding democratic institutions, safeguarding the democratic debate in the world. So I think that we are well positioned to construct a more democratic, a better, a more prosperous, and a less unequal world together, hand in hand.
Domestically, you talked about probably today and the next few days will be most important to see how Bolsonaro reacts differently or comes out in support, at least congratulates Lula, or how that pans out. You pointed out again those 99 people who are from his party in terms of domestic legislature and even the regional governors. There's an interesting question that's again come from one of our viewers, Matara, who says, are there far left anarchic forces in Brazil which are as forceful as the far right forces?
Not really. The far left in Brazil is almost in existence. And that's a question that I very often get, because I run the Observatório of the far right in Brazil. And many people ask me, why don't you study the far left? And I say, because the far left is not meaningful in this country. I mean, I'd say that the far left is not really meaningful in most Western democracies, and in most democracies, more broadly speaking, because the far left is revolutionary, and the far left is not really willing to play by the democratic rules of the game. So we might see some people complaining about the bourgeois democracy here and there, but it's not really the way the left wing in Brazil has played out over the last century or so. We have a very moderate left, to be honest. We have two big left-wing parties, the Workers' Party, which is Lula's party. It has a labor union background and also connected to the Catholic base movement of the 1980s. So it's a very moderate, it's a very down-to-earth kind of left, concerned about workers, thinking about things in terms of class and empowering workers. So it's very much connected to the labor unions, as I said before. And then we have PSOL, P-S-O-L, which is a much smaller party. They are, of course, allies with Lula, but it's a much smaller party which tries to push for progressive policies such as minority rights, women's rights, Black people rights in Brazil, LGBT people's rights, and so on and so forth. So we have basically a big traditional left and a smaller progressive, more like an American kind of left, American progressive kind of left. And there are some other left-wing parties in Brazil, but they are much smaller and they are not very different from the two that I've mentioned. So that's the kind of left that we have. It's not a super huge political camp. Lula, and I think that's an important thing to mention. Lula has not won because he's left-wing, right? Of course, there are many people who love Lula because of his social policies, because he's left-wing, because he cares about women and LGBT folks, because he fights racism. But at the same time, what has made Lula won was a combination of his progressive agenda and his personality and charisma. I mean, there are many people who love Lula, even if they don't care about the Workers' Party. So Lula's got a charisma of his own, like an aura, a shining aura. And at the same time, there's a third element, which is Lula has been able to put together a national unity front in Brazil. Under the claims that they were fighting for democracy. They were not really fighting for left and right anymore, because Bolsonaro, at the end of the day, doesn't represent the liberal kind of democracy that we believe in Brazil. So Lula has brought together many people from all across the board, left and right. We have center-right folks in Lula's administration. We have very liberal economists in Lula's administration or in Lula's campaign. We don't know exactly how the cabinet is going to be formed. If Lula is going to put, for example, a liberal economist in charge of the Ministry of the Economy. But I really believe that Lula, as a very seasoned politician and as a great negotiator, he'll be able to put together and to hold together many different political forces from all across the board who believe in democracy, who are committed to rebuilding democracy and rebuilding institutions and policies for the future, And the fact that Lula has already stated that he's not going to run for a second term, I think that it sort of reveals that Lula's main legacy will be a successful transition back to democracy. That's what he wants to leave for the country. A successful foreign policy, of course, a prosperous country in economic terms, but also a pacified country in political terms. Whether he'll be able to do it, it's very hard to tell because the opposition will be fierce. But at the same time, I really believe that Lula, he doesn't want to go down as an unsuccessful president after leaving office in 2010 with more than 80% of popularity. So I think that Lula will try to follow the same path. It's going to be challenging. As I've been saying, it's going to be an uphill battle in many respects. But I really believe that Lula will be able to pacify the country, or at least start building the conditions for future pacification starting in 2026.
You mentioned a lot of cooperation that India and Brazil could do, or could at least lead the world in, whether it's democracy. You talked about energy, IPSA, BRICS, but just leave you with a comment that again Matara has made, that what about some cooperation and support from Brazil for Indian football? That would get resonance.
You see, I would love that, but to be honest, I don't think Brazil has yet recovered from the seven goals that we took from Germany back in 2014. One day, I was talking to some friends who are like political scientists and sociologists. We were trying to understand where did the Brazilian crisis begin, or when. And I think that people were consensual to point out the Brazilian defeat for Germany in 2014 in the World Cup in Brazil as the beginning of Brazil's downhill trajectory. And it was very depressing at the time. I love soccer. I'm a big soccer fan, but I sort of stopped watching the World Cup after the 7-1 against Germany. I don't remember anything from the Russia World Cup in 2018. I was too much concerned with elections at the time. Usually the World Cup comes a couple of months before the elections in Brazil. And there's a joke going around in Brazil that Brazils are only patriotic every 4 years. And it's not because of the elections, it's because of the World Cup. But I think that 2022 will be a different situation, because now we are done with the elections. Now we can sleep calmly at night. So probably we're going to have a little bit more room to enjoy the World Cup as we used to do back in the day. And of course, if Brazil wins this World Cup, which I hope it does, we'll be happy to offer whatever we have to offer in terms of soccer to many countries, including India. And you also have to teach us about badminton and other sports that we are, and cricket, which we are completely ignorant about.
Absolutely. Professor Casarões, it was an absolute pleasure having you on StratNews Global. Thank you so much for your time, for your experience, and your expertise.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
The pleasure is all StratNews Global's, and thanks to all our viewers and the engagement that we got. You can also help support us. There's a UPI QR code that is up on your screens, or should be up on your screen shortly. If not, there is a link in the YouTube descriptor that you can do. You can also buy a YouTube Super Thanks. That's the heart icon that will appear just where you've given the thumbs up to this video on YouTube soon after this stream ends. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.